Do you like sports? Do you like art? What about science? Giraffes? Giraffe scientists that paint rugby games? It's all available on Audible, the biggest audiobook site with the largest selection of audiobooks this side of the inner solar system. No need to use your boring old eyes anymore. The ears are the future, my friend. Why, you're using them right now. So check out Audible and get your listen on. Go to www.readlearnlivepodcast.com/audible to start your 30-day free trial today.
We know that in many sports events, if you are the underdog, you have nothing to lose, and you can often have a superhuman effort because you have nothing to lose.
All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of the Read, Learn, Live podcast. Today, I'm super excited to have William Silber, the author of The Power of Nothing to Lose, The Hail Mary Effect in Politics, War, and Business. William, thanks so much for joining me on the program.
It's a pleasure, John, and please call me Bill.
Sure thing, Bill. And pleasure is all mine. Really happy to have you. It was a great opportunity to read your book. I think it was really fascinated me and had so many interesting stories, and I learned so much, from history and got a great picture of all these different parts of the world pulled together. So, I think just for everyone that's listening, why don't we just kick it off with a broad overview? If you could just tell our listeners in your own words, kind of what the book is all about.
So I think it would be helpful if I give you just the genesis, how
Sure.
this thing started,
Yeah.
and then that will sort of lead into what the book is about. So I've been thinking about this book for a long time, like 30 years,
Wow.
while I've been teaching a course at NYU Stern School of Business. The course is on investments, and it deals with how people should choose among various risky investments, stocks, bonds, real estate, and so on. And I quickly realized that the same principles that people use to choose among risky investments also applies to presidents, generals, and ordinary people making decisions under risk.
Mm-hmm.
And there was one result uh, which was especially interesting, and that is when investors and when people have downside protection, limited losses, they tend to become reckless. They take on lots more risk than they would in ordinary times. And this was so important that I developed a little game to convince people that that was the right way to behave. Do you want to hear the game?
I would love to hear the game.
Okay, so the game is, this course was kind of mathematical, and in order to give it, a little relaxed atmosphere, the last month of class, I had a contest. And the contest was the following. I gave students a list of about 10 securities, 10 different kind of assets, stocks, Apple stock, bonds, US Treasury bonds, commodities like oil. And I said, if you pick the one that has the biggest profit over the last month of class, you will get 1.5 points added to your final grade.
Hmm.
And if you pick the worst, nothing happens except you get our sympathy. How should you choose? So some people say, well, of course, I'm going to guess. Well, guessing is not a great strategy,
Hmm.
but it quickly became clear that the best choice would, in fact, be the riskiest asset, because the riskiest asset has the biggest chance, the highest chance of going up the most.
Hmm.
It also has the biggest chance of going down the most. But who cares if it goes down? You don't lose points on your final grade for that. Therefore, the right decision is to do something, to pick the riskiest security, even though you would ordinarily not do that.
Yeah. So did you have a lot of students that made that right choice?
Well, many students made the right choice, but in order to drive home the point, I had a slight variation. I said, okay, now we could play a different game if you like. And that is, I'll give you 5 points on your final grade if you pick the winner, and you lose 5 points if you pick the loser.
Mm.
All of a sudden, nobody wants to play. Why don't they want to play? It's too risky.
Right.
So, downside protection promotes risky decisions. And this is even clearer when we talk about one of the best quarterbacks ever to play the football game, and that is Aaron Rodgers.
Yeah.
Aaron Rodgers, in the last 30 seconds of a game, will throw a Hail Mary pass. What's a Hail Mary pass? A heave into the end zone.
Right.
If Green Bay is losing by 3 or 4 points and the guy happens to catch the pass, they win. And what happens if there's an interception? Well, that's the worst that can happen. No big deal. So when Aaron Rodgers has what we call a skewed outcome, limited loss, but upside is very, very big, he too becomes a risk taker. In an ordinary part of the game, he is a very decisive and very careful quarterback. He won't throw interceptions. But when he has downside protection, he doesn't care about the interception. He takes big risks.
Right. Yeah, and I think that was totally the point of the book, and I think just all the different examples you had throughout history and all that really drove that point home well. And you mentioned that the genesis of this book was over 30 years. A long time you've really been thinking about this issue. So once you finally decided, okay, I'm ready to write this down, I'm ready to pull all this material together and turn it into a book. How was that experience for you? Because I know you've written a lot, throughout your career of a lot of different things, articles or other books or, other materials, papers or whatever. How was this book in terms of comparing it to all those other things? Had you done so many before that this was kind of easy pulling it together, or was this still like very difficult, or what was that overall experience of actually writing the book like once you had the firm idea?
Well, the idea sounds so simple. It sounds so simple. Of course, if I have big upside and no downside, I'm going to take big risks. What's so important about that? And the key is that there were some major developments in history which depended on generals, presidents, and ordinary people making those kinds of decisions. So the key to this book is to show the power of nothing to lose in areas where we really aren't looking for that, where all of a sudden it happens. And in point of fact, the way I do this is follow my nose.
Mm.
What does follow my nose mean in this context? I read an article in a newspaper and it happens to mention something that I said, oh, that's a surprise. And then I don't stop there. I go to the original sources. So let me give you an example. So we know that Aaron Rodgers will take on risk when he has nothing to lose, but so do Asian spiders do the
Mm.
same thing. There was a study of the male orb-web spider, an Asian spider, that during sex, the genital organs of the male break off after sex. He becomes a eunuch,
Mm.
and then he guards the female to ensure his paternity. And the scientist, the biologist, observed that this male orb-web spider was a fierce battler. He won just about all the battles with other spiders trying to get into the female. So they, in fact, staged. I'm not making this up. I couldn't make this up.
Yeah.
They, in fact, stage battles between the eunuch spider and a fully endowed male. And in fact, what they found was the male orb-web spider almost uniformly defeated them. And they said, and I quote, because he no longer had a reproductive future, and therefore he had nothing to lose.
Mm.
So from Aaron Rodgers throwing a Hail Mary pass because he has nothing to lose, we find in the animal kingdom the same kind of behavior. Now that was amazing.
Yeah. And did this, so as you were writing the book, did it kind of come together quickly? Like, were you able to really follow your nose and poke around and really find a bunch of things that you felt like, oh, this is great material? Or did you spend a few years working on it, or kind of what was that process like?
Nothing comes easy when you're writing,
Yeah.
at least from me. And you have to follow your nose, but you really have to make sure you're going to the end of the story and make sure that you're telling a story that actually happened.
Mm-hmm.
And what stunned me was not just the Asian spiders that behave that way, but one of the most famous scenes in American history also had the same kind of nothing to lose decision making. We have all seen the picture of George Washington crossing the Delaware. And what he was doing when he was crossing the Delaware, he was going to Trenton to fight the Hessians. He was doing this because his army was in disarray.
Mm.
The army, and this was in 1776, General Sir William Howe, one of the British general, had defeated the Continentals in battles in New York, on Long Island, and so on. And Washington's army, this was in the middle of the winter, had huge desertions.
Mm-hmm.
And he wrote to his cousin when thinking about this dangerous attack on Trenton, New Jersey. He wrote to his cousin in Mount Vernon, if this attack fails, I think the game will be pretty well up.
Mm.
Now, that's just what Aaron Rodgers would have said in the huddle at the last play of the game. Namely, if we don't connect on this Hail Mary, we're going to lose the game. Well, Washington didn't use the words Hail Mary, they weren't around, but he said, we're going to lose. Mm-hmm. And therefore, his attack was basically promoted in his own mind because he had nothing to lose. If he didn't attack, his army would be in disarray. And if he attacks and wins, which in fact he did, that will be a new beginning, which in
Right.
fact is what happened.
Huh.
So there's an example
Yeah, yeah.
of seeing something that in a completely different light.
Yeah.
Washington crossing the Delaware.
Yeah, I want to, go through I want to go through some of the examples in the book just like that. I mean, you had one of them was you had an entire chapter on Rosa Parks and, what happened with the, her not getting able to proceed and what led to the bus boycott and all that. And, it was, there was, it's one of those stories where you feel like you know some of it, but I really learned more, from reading what you had written there. And especially about, the idea that there was actually someone before Rosa Parks that had gone through a similar circumstance, but they didn't necessarily want to pick her, and they kind of honed in on Rosa Parks as the right choice, for many reasons. And so I guess, I'm curious to know why Rosa Parks was like the perfect choice to fight this battle. And, given that there were threats against her and her life and all the other people involved, it seems like she did have something to lose, right? I mean, I think what people were pushing for is, hey, back away from this case and you'll live. And if you don't, you'll die. We're going to keep attacking your house or, the people that are involved. So it seems like, there wasn't really downside protection here, or at least not as much. So I was trying to kind of parse through that, and I was wondering if you could help me better understand.
Sure. Now, the Rosa Parks case was not on my list when I started. It was
Mm-hmm.
the furthest thing from my list because this clearly was a very dangerous activity back then. She
Yeah.
could easily have lost her life. Uh, in fact, her husband was against her pursuing the case while it was happening.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I was able to include uh, this momentous historical event was a quote that I found when I was reading her autobiography. It was a very slim autobiography. And she described in retrospect, she said, if we are being mistreated, and if we do nothing, it will continue. I'm not frightened because I have nothing to lose.
Mm.
That meant that there may be some physical danger that I am in, and she surely was, but the mistreatment that she felt was something that would never go away.
Mm-hmm.
And in her mind, she had nothing to lose by standing her ground, refusing to get up from a seat in the white section of a bus. And in point of fact, as you correctly said, there was someone, Claudia Colvin, a little earlier than that, 3 months earlier than that, who in fact had the same arrest, but they did not want to use Claudia Colvin. And one of the reasons that Claudia Colvin was not the 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 case that they pursued was because she was young and she was quite feisty. And um, E.D. Dixon, who was head of the NAACP at the time, said she would not be the best candidate for us. I need someone who is more mature, more responsible, in control of their emotions. And I would say that Rosa Parks was like Jackie Robinson.
Mm.
Jackie Robinson was not the first Black that was considered, but in point of fact, when Branch Rickey hired him, he said, this is the guy who is both very intelligent and also in control of his emotions. And that's what Rosa Parks was. She was in control of her emotions. And that was why she was the ideal candidate. She paid quite a heavy price. She was fired from her job. She had to move to Detroit. But in her mind, she had nothing to lose. The other interesting thing about this case, and then I'll stop, is that there were huge collateral benefits. It wasn't about Rosa Parks. It was about segregation. So there were huge, what we rarely hear the word collateral benefits. But in this case, there were huge collateral benefits, unlike other kinds of nothing to lose circumstances that create great collateral damage.
Hmm. Yeah, so I think what you were getting at then is that even if there was, threats to her body, or there was kind of like really serious threats to her, it was more of her state of mind that she felt she had nothing to lose. And so you can still have that kind of dichotomy and it still works as long as the person that's acting, it feels like they have nothing to lose, even if they might personally, there might be something there that could happen.
Her objective was to end segregation.
Right.
And she knew that if she didn't do it, the problem would continue. So in her mind, that was her objective. She had nothing to lose at this point because the segregation would continue.
Yeah. One other thing, there's a lot of discussion of what goes on in prisons and what the situation around pardons and commutations. I thought that those two discussions were really really interesting. So I mean, first off, I think earlier on in the book you talk about pardons and commutations, and what we see happening is, how towards the end of a particular politician's time in office, they tend to issue a ton of pardons, and you give a lot of examples of some of the more notorious people here. And you have a solution. Some states use this pardon review board to try and, make sure that outside people are kind of looking at this, and it's not just one person that can do any of this. I guess what I'm curious about is, first off, given that we see it happening again and again and again, why is it that this hasn't happened? Is it just that the politicians are in control of the decision to start up a pardon review board, and that would mean losing some power? Or, what is it that's actually holding the changes back that would be needed to solve this problem?
Yeah, so the example of pardons is that uh, lame duck presidents,
Hmm.
lame duck governors tend to give out far more pardons than they would if they were in their first term. And the reason is when you are a lame duck, the voters you no longer have to worry about pleasing the voters. So you can, in fact, do things which you would never do in your first term. Second term governors, lame duck governors, commute 50% of death penalty inmates, 50% more
Mm-hmm.
than first term governors because they can. Why can they? They don't have to worry about being labeled as soft on crime because they're not going to be going to seek reelection. They're lame ducks. We also know that presidents, both Democrats and Republicans, tend to issue what we call last minute pardons. Bill Clinton, on the last night, issued 140 pardons.
Hmm.
And some of them were quite egregious, quite egregious. And the question is, how can you, and these kinds of pardons undermine the integrity of the penal system. So why do we let presidents get away with it? The answer is they have the constitutional right to pardon. And nobody, there is no check on the president's right to pardon. But almost all states, with the exception of North Dakota and South Dakota, have pardon review boards that review pardons by governors and issue an approval or a disapproval, or actually even more, can prevent any a pardon that they deem uh, irresponsible. So the question is, why don't we have that at the federal level? Well, if you actually had it at the federal level, you would need a constitutional amendment.
Mm.
That's never going to happen. But there is nothing in the Constitution which prevents Congress from passing a law, enacting a pardon review board that will advise the president. The president has the last word. Why don't we have that? And it's hard to explain why, except to say, well, politicians may be thinking, well, one day I may need a pardon too.
Hmm.
So I have no other explanation, but the behavior of lame duck presidents in their last minute pardons and very irresponsible pardons is because they feel they have nothing to lose.
Hmm. Yeah.
Well,
And
they do, of course, have their reputations, but that
right.
sort of, gets pushed to the side
Yeah.
for for many reasons.
Yeah. Fair. So to kind of go from getting people out of prison to what happens inside prison, you have a whole discussion of prison violence. And, one thing I found really interesting there, it came shortly thereafter a chapter on kind of rogue traders. And there was a lot of discussion where these sorts of things happened again and again and again. And whether that was rogue traders or whether that was, prison violence with people that were stuck in jail for life without possibility of parole. So you're highlighting the examples you found, right, to make the case. But you also point out that, especially with the prison violence, that maybe for all lifers, that's not the case for everyone. That's not everyone is going to be super violent, even just because they're in prison. And so I guess, I'm trying to think about how do you decide about when there's enough evidence to really indicate that some sort of reform is needed, either from inside institutions or from government, policy or whatever, so, you can pick out these anecdotes and you have a lot of discussion about them. But I guess, how do you balance that idea of, is this a systemic crisis that's happening at this whatever level versus, well, okay, it's happening and it's very bad when it happens, but we can't change everything just because of some bad apples.
All right, so you have a bunch of questions in there, so
Yeah,
I'm gonna have to separate them
sure
out,
thing.
and then you can come back if you'd like to, if you want to hear something. So, it sounds like you want to know a little bit more about the behavior of rogue traders, and there's a notorious case of a fellow by the name of Nick Leeson, who was a trader for Baring Bank.
Hmm.
Baring Bank was a 200-year-old institution. Baring Bank helped Thomas Jefferson in the Louisiana, finance the Louisiana Purchase. So, and it existed for 200 years. And then in 1992, they hired a fellow by the name of Nick Leeson. Now, Nick Leeson came from a very poor background, and he wanted to be a trader, and he was hired to go out to Singapore, which had an office, where Barings had an office, and he was to manage the Singapore office and also to trade for the company's account.
Mm.
Now, most banks have traders. What does that mean? Well, the traders are allowed to buy and sell securities, and if the securities that they have bought go up in value a lot and they make a lot of money for the company, they get a big bonus.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, if they lose money, they don't have to repay the losses. Well, now when you are a trader, all of a sudden you have a very skewed payoff. What's the skewed payoff? Big upside, a big bonus if you make a lot of money. And if you lose a lot of money, nothing happens. Oh, you can get fired, but you can go to work for another firm. And they all do, even
Mm-hmm.
though they lose money. So that is a classic example of downside protection. It's
Mm-hmm.
like Aaron Rodgers all over again. And Nick Leeson took huge, huge risks, built up huge losses, which he was able to conceal from the central office in London because he was also the manager in charge of the Singapore branch. And until he lost twice as much capital as Barings had, Barings had to declare bankruptcy in 1995. This was all because of the collateral damage of his risk taking.
Mm-hmm.
If this was his own money, he would never do that because he would lose his own money and he would be much more careful.
Mm-hmm.
So he did not bear all of the costs of the bad decisions. He had what we call moral hazard when you can take an action that causes damage to others. And that's why, of course, banks and financial institutions monitor their traders. They know full well that traders have an incentive to take big risks. And every bank is worried that a trader will take too much risk. So they monitor them. Well, why does the problem continue to repeat? That was your question.
Mm-hmm.
How come we keep on hearing about rogue traders? There are many, many examples. Some people say the 2008 financial crisis occurred for that reason. That may or may not be the case, but it keeps on happening. Why does it keep on happening? Well, the answer, in part, is the banks want the upside too.
Mm-hmm.
They also like the skewed payoff, and they try to monitor their traders to keep them responsible. And if the banks aren't successful, what happens then in monitoring? What happens then? Well, either they go bankrupt or the government bails them out.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens then? We as taxpayers bear the costs. So the reason we keep on seeing it is all of the actors, all of the groups that are looking at trading see big upside, limited downside, collateral damage to others. So they therefore engage in riskier behavior than they would if it was all going to come out of their own pockets.
Yeah, agreed. One of the things you also focus on pretty extensively is medicine and medical treatments and the idea of, if someone has not very long to live, hey, let's just give them the shot. Like, why can't we just give them this experimental treatment? What do they got to lose? I read this other book, Being Mortal, and Atul Gawande, and yeah, it was interesting because he was kind of fairly critical of that idea, saying that, yes, maybe that'll help, but what kind of quality of life might people be expected to have, even if they get an extra 6 months or an extra year or something? A lot of the time, experimental treatments, they're not going to completely cure you, I think was his point, and doctors should think about the quality of life. How does that balanced, where doctors also want to just, keep their patients, going, and, don't want to be seen as someone that is going to turn people away from treatments.
Yeah, well, so I would not say that I would, if I were a doctor, I would prevent someone from trying an experimental treatment.
Mm-hmm.
That's not my role. My role is to give them the most, and I don't blame anyone with a fatal illness for taking a big risk. They have literally nothing to lose.
Hmm.
I give them, and I don't, they don't depend on me for giving them, but they have every right to leave no stone unturned. The problem is that from a society standpoint, some of the resources that are drawn into providing these experimental cures come out of other potentially more useful um, uh, ventures
Mm-hmm.
that would benefit society. So, for example, it's very important to develop antibiotics. It's very important to prepare for pandemics. No individual does that. Who does that? The government does that. Why
Mm-hmm.
does the government do that? It's a public good, just like national defense, national parks, and clean air. So the president of the United States should not be saying, guys, take some experimental drug. What do you have to lose? Donald Trump did that in the case of hydroxychloroquine. And I'm not going to say hydroxychloroquine clearly was not beneficial. Nobody knew that then. But the president should not be allocating resources on the basis of what do you have to lose?
Hmm.
It's not the right way to do it. The right way to do it is for the president to allocate resources for the common good. Let each individual who is sick, especially those who are fatally ill, let them pursue whatever they want. But from society's standpoint, the decisions have to be made in a different way than what do you have to lose?
Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And then kind of towards the end of the book, in one of the last chapters, I think you start to reference that idea that there's really like actually when you think about Hail Marys, like they don't work most of the time. There's sort of a scarcity of successes here. However, the successes are extremely prominent. We remember them because they're, if a Hail Mary pass happens, everyone reads about it in the sports section the next day because it was amazing. But when it fails, it's not quite as newsworthy. And so that there's kind of like a skewed mindset around I guess maybe the efficacy of them. So I'm just curious, is there a way to help remind ourselves that sometimes those actions have a very low likelihood of succeeding? Is there a better decision making model out there to help us kind of decide even when we feel like maybe we have nothing to lose?
So the problem with Hail Marys is you say, well, of course, this is the road to success. Why is that? Big upside, limited downside. I might as well become reckless because I'm going to always turn out to be successful, or at least I think that the upside is so big. Well, the problem is they usually don't succeed. These are what we call low probability events.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean? Well, I looked at the data and I saw that there were 400 Hail Mary passes in college football between 2005 and 2013. How many of those 400 passes succeeded in getting a touchdown and winning? The answer is 10. 2.5%. So clearly these are low probability events. So why do we hear so much about them? And the answer is a very general problem that people don't realize. It's called selection bias.
Mm.
What is we only hear about the winners. We don't hear about the losers. And the losers, they disappear like the losing thoroughbreds in the Kentucky. Anybody remember the losing thoroughbreds? They were all great horses, you know.
Mm.
Anybody in the Kentucky, any horse in the Kentucky Derby was a great horse. Nobody remembers the losers, but there can be great consequences. Let me give you an example.
Yeah.
There were three presidential candidates over the last 40 years that picked vice presidents that were widely considered Hail Marys.
Mm-hmm.
You remember them? Well, you know, we may remember some of them because one of them happened maybe 15 years ago when John McCain was the Republican candidate and facing Barack Obama. He was losing terribly. So he chose, little known at the time, Sarah Palin.
Mm-hmm.
She was the governor of Alaska. That was widely described in the press as a Hail Mary. I didn't say it, they said it.
Yeah.
And in 1984, Walter Mondale was trying to unseat Ronald Reagan. He too was way behind, and he picked Geraldine Ferraro, the first woman vice presidential candidate for a major party,
Mm-hmm.
widely considered a Hail Mary in the press. And there was one more. One more was Robert Dole, who faced Bill Clinton in 1996 in the second term. He was going to lose. So he chose Jack Kemp, former quarterback of the Buffalo Bills. These were all called Hail Marys.
Mm-hmm.
They are, some of us, I mean, you know, if I sat here and asked you, did you remember them all? Maybe you would have gotten one or two, but
Yeah.
I don't know, all three is pretty tough. We don't remember these things, but they have great consequences. They have great impacts. In part, I think, the fact that Geraldine Ferraro was the vice presidential candidate in 1984. Sarah Palin was the vice presidential candidate in 2008, made it much easier for Kamala Harris to be the vice presidential candidate in 2020. So the consequences of Hail Marys, even though they have very low probabilities of success, often have, in that case, collateral benefits, but more often than not, great collateral damage.
Mm.
And there's one case which we haven't talked about, which I'm going to bring it up.
Sure.
And that is during World War II, after the United States and Britain invaded Normandy on D-Day and swept across what had been occupied France and pushed the Germans to the edge of the Rhine, right at the border. They were the German, almost all German generals said, let's at least sue for peace and keep some of our manpower, avoid further deaths. Hitler, on the other hand, felt like a staggered boxer.
Mm.
And he then had a staggered boxer's counterpunch, egged on by his propaganda minister. He was told the United States has demanded unconditional surrender. That means the end of the German people, the end of the German state. Germans have, ready, nothing to lose by fighting. After all, there's unconditional surrender. We're going to lose everything. So what Hitler did was orchestrate something called the Battle of the Bulge. The Battle of the Bulge was desperate, a desperate heave, a desperate Hail Mary to try to break through the Allied front, and he did not succeed, but he caused great collateral damage. He didn't care that German soldiers would be killed. That was not something that bothered him. And not only that, German officers in the Waffen SS, which was the Nazi Party's armed soldiers, were told, don't take any prisoners. And what that resulted in was the greatest atrocity against American troops in Europe during World War II, the murder of 71 prisoners of war near the Belgian town of Malmedy. Prisoners of war are supposed to be treated as prisoners, mm-hmm. and they were murdered. And in fact, the people who were responsible for that went to trial at the end of World War II, and they were sentenced to death. But after 4 or 5 years, those death sentences were commuted, but not the collateral damage. Why was there collateral damage? Because Hitler did not bear all of the costs mm-hmm. of his decisions, just like the traitors, in a very, very different and a very, very, in a monetary sense, didn't bear all of the costs associated with their risk-taking. So you have to be extremely careful when people feel they have nothing to lose about the collateral damage visited on society.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And just to kind of wrap things up, I know we've covered a lot today, a lot of different stories that are in the book. There's still a lot more in there that we didn't get to talk about. But are there any kind of overarching ideas or anything else you wanted people to take away from this that we haven't had time to touch on today?
The one thing I'll tell you is read the book.
Right. No, there's even more information in there and great more examples. Yeah.
I think if you read the book, and I'm going to just leave you with one thought which we didn't touch on, but I'm going to mention the title of the last chapter, Freedom to Succeed. We know that in many sports events, if you are the underdog, you have nothing to lose, and you can often have a superhuman effort because you have nothing to lose. There are a couple of simple examples. The example of the 1969 Mets, who were in last place for the previous 7 years, and they were 100-1 underdogs, and they played like they had nothing to lose. The American men's hockey team that upset the Russians in the 1980 Olympics. The New York Jets who upset the Baltimore Colts in the 1969 Super Bowl. These were all teams that played as though they had nothing to lose. And that is part of a strategy for personal success. It's not enough. It's not enough. What do you have to do? And I'm going to quote Venus Williams, who had to stop playing in 2014. In 2011, she tried to make a comeback in 2014. She made it to the third round of Wimbledon. They asked her, how did she succeed? She said, you must give it your all. You must practice. You must do everything possible. And then, of course, play as though you have nothing to lose. A complete recipe for personal success.
There it is. All right. Well, on that note, I like to kind of end things with a quick thunder round, a little getting to know you, then We'll call it a day. Sound good?
Good.
All right. What is your favorite food and or drink?
Favorite food is chocolate mousse.
Ooh,
Nice and thick and very chocolatey.
sounds delicious. Where is your favorite place you've ever been?
Jerusalem.
Hmm.
It's the city of ages. It's an ancient city with a modern touch. There's nothing like it in the world.
Yeah. All right. Last question. If you could wave a magic wand and change any one thing, what would it be and why?
Yeah, I want the Jets to win another Super Bowl.
Fair. Fair. Yeah, I like it.
We
You
are
have your
we are
answer.
50 years of long-suffering Jets fans. It's time. That's it.
That's
That's
it.
my
No,
wish.
it's your wand. You get to choose. Well, on that note, Bill, this has been great. The book again, The Power of Nothing to Lose, the Hail Mary Effect in Politics, War, and Business, filled with a lot of other really interesting stories that we didn't have time to get into. But thanks again for coming on the show.
It's a pleasure. You did a great job.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Read, Learn, Live. If you liked it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. If you hated it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. And so it goes.